So, welcome to video number 7, and let's learn about vertebrates on land. So, I can tell you as vital context for this that all land vertebrates are members of a single clade called the tetrapods, and indeed, some aquatic animals are just tetrapods that have returned at some point to the sea. So, it's worth having that as context. Now, we've just learned about how arthropods appear on land from about 425 million years ago, and the first vertebrates on land actually appeared during the Devonian. Really, vertebrate life on land kicks off between 385 and 375 million years ago, so about 50 million years after the first traces of arthropod life on land. Tetrapods as a group evolved from lungfishes. This is a group that is still around today. These are fish, as the name would suggest, that use their modified swim bladder that is become a lung to breathe air. And you can see some examples, A and B here, of lungfish from around the time that that vertebrate life was evolving to live on land at the top. So these are examples of what we call tetrapodomorph fishes, meaning that they look like tetrapods. They share, for example, the skull shape that you can see so nicely in these silhouette diagrams, with classic examples of what we consider early transitional land vertebrates. And you can see some examples of these transitional land vertebrates in the middle row here, C and D. This is Acanthostega and Ichthyostega. Whilst biomechanics studies of the skeletons of these are ongoing, a nice example from a while ago now, from 2012, is cited at the bottom of this slide here. We can say that we think these were still largely aquatic animals, but they were aquatic animals that could flop around on land when they wanted to. For example, the latest work suggests that Ichthyostega, shown on the right-hand side here, may have been a little bit more terrestrial in its habits than Acanthostega, shown on the left, and was more robust. Tetrapods have then, since this time, evolved more adaptations for life on land. So, for example, important developments in tetrapods have been to have fully developed pectoral and pelvic girdles, so bones that separate the walking stuff from the skull, so you don't, hear every step as you're walking. So these kind of rings of bone that are still found in tetrapods today became separated and enlarged fairly early in tetrapod evolution. So, based on what you can see on this slide here, limb evolution occurred first in the water, but then continued when this group of organisms moved onto land. The example that I've put at the bottom here is an early amphibian-like land animal from about 345 million years ago. So that's a little bit after these two, so is no longer this kind of typical transitional form that you can see in the middle examples here. I have to report that sadly there are important gaps here too. Vital early transitions in the evolution of tetrapods are poorly documented due to a gap in the fossil record that we call Romer's gap in the world of tetrapods. This spans around 30 million years in the early Carboniferous. That's actually accompanied by a bigger gap in the world of terrestrial arthropods. As this graph shows, there are no newly described arthropod orders between 380 and 350 million years ago. There's long been debate as to the cause of this really patchy fossil record at this vital point in the assembly of terrestrial ecosystems. And we know that this is in part due to a low number of rocks that could sample a terrestrial environment. And possibly that is accompanied by elements of the geochemistry of this time that may not have lent itself towards fossilization. But there have also been recent suggestions in the literature, and you can see a whole host of interesting literature on this slide here, that reflects that at least, or suggests that at least in the world of vertebrates, there is a real lack of diversity during this time period. So in the world of vertebrates in particular, vertebrates, including most tetrapods, during the early Carboniferous are recovering from an extinction at the end of the Devonian period, and that presumably led to an evolutionary bottleneck. And so what we're seeing here is a period of recovery from that extinction that's correlated with a period of unusually low atmospheric oxygen. That oxygen concentrations are shown in this graph here. And that has been independently determined from the idiosyncratic geochemistry of rocks that are formed during Romer's Gap. So you've got this situation here where you've got potentially low diversity because of this extinction, coupled with weird geochemistry of the time, leading to a paucity in the world, especially of vertebrates that's shown in this cyan graph on the right-hand side here during Romer's Gap, and very few newly described arthropods as well. I should highlight, though, that there are a number of recent papers that do report some fossils from Scotland that are helping to fill this gap a little bit. So we've got this kind of this period where we don't pick up that much of the evolution of our groups of interest, but that may represent in part sampling and in part an actual lack of diversity at this time. So do bear that in mind. But moving past Romer's Gap, that brings us into the late Carboniferous period. So essentially, we've moved from the Silurian through the Devonian, the development of forests, through through vertebrates coming onto land, through Romer's Gap, into the late Carboniferous period. So we learned about the Carboniferous in our paleoecology material for this course. So if you want to revisit that, go back and look at the Carboniferous rainforest collapse section of paleoecology. But for our purposes today, I just wanted to highlight that, as shown in these paleo maps here, we have this situation in the Carboniferous where Pangaea was assembling. We have a low-lying broad band of what we could describe as rainforest-type ecosystems, a tropical region that had a warm and humid environment that provided perfect growing conditions for a diverse array of plant groups, and in turn, they provided habitats for an array of organisms. And these are conditions that then disappeared with that Carboniferous rainforest collapse into the Permian as we got increasing aridification of the supercontinent, as represented by the loss of all of the coals we have preserved from the Carboniferous period, shown in black here, being replaced with evaporite deposits, rocks that deposited in very, very dry conditions. Indeed, all of the coal that fueled the Industrial Revolution in the UK and Central Europe, and of course in North America, all of that is linked to this situation, this paleobiogeography, but also the fact that by this time we had these rich, dense forests made of trees, and those trees had lots of a compound called lignin in their woody tissues. So lignin is one of the things that gives wood its strength. And nothing at this time had really evolved to deal with lignin when a tree fell over, and therefore it just stuck around, ultimately becoming the coal, being buried, becoming the coal that we dig up to fuel the Industrial Revolution and everything since. It was also a time of higher oxygen concentrations. Associated with the coal that we find and we've dug up over the last 200 or so years, we get a really good sampling of Carboniferous life on land. And that allows us to provide quite a clear picture before the PT extinction 250 million years ago of what land ecosystems were like towards the end of the Paleozoic period. These fossils allow us to paint a fairly, I think, accurate picture of what life was like during the Carboniferous. So this unique snapshot, really, into land ecosystems before the PT extinction at 250 million years ago. So we know that these extensive coal swamps consisted of both seedless plants and seed plants. Examples of the diverse plant life that are shown here include tree-like relatives of a group that's still alive today, the club mosses, and these form the main body of lowland swampy forests, such as the one shown in this image. They grew to a height in excess of 50 meters. They're really quite big. These are giants. And they typically consisted of a single trunk supported by shallow roots, and that trunk bore leaf pads and it had a crown with reproductive organs on it. You can see one of the trunks of one of these organisms in this reconstruction here on this image. There were also early relatives of horsetails and of wide variety of ferns, such as you can see in the image here. Indeed, ferns were a common sight in the coal forests and exhibited a variety of different morphologies, from small plants to larger tree-like forms. So we've got a very clear picture of what plant life was like during the Carboniferous. And as you can see from this graph, which I'll return to here, vertebrate life on land also really kicked off during the late Carboniferous period, so about this at this point in our timeline, which you can see here. Vertebrates at this time were probably predators consuming either freshwater fish or land-based arthropods. In vertebrates, a restricting factor up until this point in the Carboniferous had been reproduction. For most of the early tetrapods, eggs had to be laid in water and fertilization had to occur in water as well. But several pivotal phases in tetrapod evolution helped overcome this, and we think those might have occurred in the Carboniferous coal forests. Certainly, we can say that we think the split between the true amphibians, that's a group called the Lysamphibia, which includes frogs, caecilians, and salamanders today, and a group called the amniotes, that's mammals and the diapsids. The diapsids is a group that includes reptiles and birds alive today. A split between those two may have occurred in the late Devonian. It's hard to pin down, thanks to Romer's gap, but we first really pick it up in the Carboniferous coal forests. So let's dig into that a little bit deeper. So the relationships of early tetrapods in the Carboniferous and what evolved from them is a matter of active debate and research. But based on my reading, currently, I think the more widely held hypothesis is that the true amphibians that I mentioned in the last slide, the Lysamphibians, the origins of this group lies closer to a group that was alive in the Carboniferous that we call the temnospondylus, which is shown on the left-hand side of this slide here. These are animals that are defined by a broad skull with a rounded front margin and an open palate, at least half as wide as the skull. In contrast, there's a group called the lepospondylus that's shown in the middle here. These are probably closer in terms of their affinities to the amniotes. So that's the group that includes the mammals, the birds, and the reptiles. They were generally at this time, the leptospondylus, smaller than the temnospondylus, and they had a large variety of different forms. True amniotes, and an early example of these is shown on the right-hand side here. So this is a member of this grouping that includes the mammals, the birds, and the reptiles that are still alive today, have also been found in the Carboniferous. Organisms that are a grade of organization similar to what we call reptiles today were similar in form at this time, being small to medium-sized insect eaters. And it was actually during the Permian period after the Carboniferous that there was an explosion in amniote diversity. So early amniotes are a typical representative of this group is shown on the right-hand side here. And they have their origins in the Carboniferous. In terms of our arthropods on land, actually, by the Carboniferous, arthropod life on land was fairly familiar. The major divisions in the tree of life of arthropods that still live on land today are present by the Carboniferous. You can see some nice examples of Carboniferous land animals on this slide here. So as an example, this is a thing called a trinotarbid, an early a relative of the spiders. The first true spiders appear during the Carboniferous as well. This right here is a whip spider, a gorgeous creature, and a group that's still around today. There were some groups that are no longer around today. This is an example of a group of organisms called the arthroplurids. These are superficially similar in appearance to millipedes. They grew huge. They grew up to about 3 meters long. Why that is, is a matter of active debate, and I can happily tell you more about it if you want to learn about it. Do just get in touch if that is the case. And these are probably, we think nowadays, stem group members of the millipedes. And there were a few insects that got really, really big as well. So these are examples of a group of insects closely related, we think, to dragonflies and mayflies that could get up to about 2 meters in wingspan. There was also a group of insects shown on the right-hand side here that specialized in feeding on plant tissues that is one of the only major lineages of the insects to go extinct at the PT boundary. So we've got a few groups that have since gone extinct in the Carboniferous rainforests in terms of the arthropods, but otherwise we're looking at fairly familiar communities on the grand scheme of things. It's worth also highlighting that by this point, insects had taken to the skies, and insects were therefore the first group of organisms to develop powered flight. Vertebrates that have done so far later than this. And if you want to learn more about that, I would just flag that we covered that in the macroevolution lectures in video number 5. So if you want to learn more about the evolution of insect wings, which allowed insects to fly, do go ahead and check that out. And that brings me to the end of this video about vertebrates moving on to land. And let's go on to video number 8, which is going to try and look at some of the major things that have happened since this point in the evolution of life on land. So I'll see you there very shortly.